Imagine the rain pouring down in the darkest part of town. You see a beloved cat, battered and bruised, struggling to survive, his owner, Mrs. Johnson, desperate to save him. This is Max's story, a journey of love, loss, and hope that will tug at your heartstrings. Will he survive the longest night of his life? Find out in this emotional tale of loyalty and strength, only here on Animal Craze. Rain poured down relentlessly, shrouding the dark alley in a cold, oppressive fog. The storm showed no mercy as it pounded the streets, each drop heavy and unrelenting. In the darkness, Max lay battered and bruised, his small body broken and bleeding. His once bright green eyes were now dulled with pain, and his soft, gray fur was matted and soaked from the rain. As he lay there, too weak to move, a familiar voice broke through the sound of the storm. "Max! No! Oh, please don't leave me!" Mrs. Johnson's voice trembled with desperation as she rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she gently lifted his frail body into her arms. She held him close, feeling his faint heartbeat against her chest. Max gave a weak meow, barely able to lift his gaze to meet hers, but even in his pain, his eyes softened, recognizing the love and worry in her face. Without wasting another moment, Mrs. Johnson sprinted toward her car, cradling Max protectively. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest as fear clawed at her mind. She had never seen Max so weak, so close to slipping away. As she drove through the rain-slicked streets, her hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel, and her thoughts were a whirlwind of worry. She knew she had to get Max help, and fast. Minutes later, she pulled up to Whisker Hospital, the town's main veterinary clinic. The bright neon sign was a beacon of hope in the bleak night, but her heart sank when she was greeted by Nurse Whiskers, a stern-faced calico who met them at the door with a frown. "We can't admit stray cats," Nurse Whiskers said, her tone cold and unyielding. Her gaze flickered over Max dispassionately, as though he were merely an inconvenience. Mrs. Johnson's face flushed with anger and desperation. "He's not a stray. He's my Max. Please, you have to help him," she pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. But Nurse Whiskers remained unmoved, her expression indifferent. Mrs. Johnson's heart broke a little more as she looked down at Max, who let out a faint, exhausted meow. Defeated but undeterred, she turned away, clutching Max tightly as she rushed back to her car. She refused to let this be the end. She refused to give up on Max. Determined, she whispered softly to him, "I'll find another hospital, Max. Just hold on a little longer. You'll be okay." Her voice was strong, but her eyes were wet with tears. The rain continued to fall as she sped through the night, the headlights cutting through the storm as they raced toward Hope Animal Hospital, the only other clinic nearby. Inside the car, Mrs. Johnson's anxiety mounted with every second. She glanced down at Max, who lay limp in her lap, his breathing shallow and labored. The sight of him in such a state tore at her heart. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of Hope Animal Hospital. The warm, welcoming lights inside shone through the windows, and Mrs. Johnson's heart swelled with a flicker of hope. She rushed inside, clutching Max protectively as she approached the front desk. Dr. Jenkins, a kind-eyed vet with a gentle smile, looked up and immediately took in the severity of the situation. "We'll do everything we can to help him," he said, his voice full of compassion. His words were a balm to Mrs. Johnson's frayed nerves, and she nodded gratefully, her hands shaking as she handed Max over to the skilled team of veterinarians. She watched as they wheeled him away, disappearing into the depths of the hospital. Left alone in the waiting room, Mrs. Johnson felt the weight of fear and worry pressing down on her. She paced back and forth, glancing anxiously at the door every few minutes, hoping to see Dr. Jenkins with news. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, imagining the worst and hoping for the best. After what felt like hours, Dr. Jenkins finally returned, his face solemn. Mrs. Johnson's heart leaped into her throat as she saw the look in his eyes. "Max's injuries are severe. We need to operate immediately," he said quietly. Mrs. Johnson's face paled as she clutched her chest. "Will he make it?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Dr. Jenkins hesitated, and in that pause, Mrs. Johnson felt the weight of uncertainty crushing down on her. "We'll do everything possible," he replied, his tone serious yet filled with determination. With a nod, he turned and disappeared back into the operating room, leaving Mrs. Johnson alone once more. The waiting room was silent, The only sounds the occasional beep of the machines and the distant murmurs of the hospital staff. Mrs. Johnson sat down, her head in her hands, praying silently, begging the universe to spare her beloved Max. Memories flooded her mind, of Max as a tiny kitten, chasing shadows across the floor, of him curling up in her lap on lazy Sunday afternoons, of his soft purrs that never failed to calm her after a long day. The thought of losing him was too much to bear. Hours passed, and still there was no word. The quiet of the hospital grew heavier, and Mrs. Johnson's heart ached with each passing minute. She felt a hollow emptiness beginning to settle in her chest, a gnawing fear that this might be the end. That's the end of Max's journey, a story of love, loss, and the bonds that never break. Thank you for watching Animal Craze, where we bring you heartwarming and heart-wrenching stories of our beloved animal friends. If you want more stories like Max's, hit that subscribe button, join the Animal Craze family, and never miss an episode. Remember, love knows no bounds, and the ones we've lost are never truly gone. They live on in our hearts forever.